Hello, can you hear me?
Other than a lot of background noise, but I think I can manage to hear you.
Oh, sorry. I'm on the road. Okay. So, the word policy to me is kind of like a guiding document, sort of like a guideline to guide the do's and don'ts and explaining the do's and don'ts of anything.
Yes, and for me, the word policy talks more of, yeah, like Mustafa has said, rules, guidelines. So there are more of principles for which you are to go by in some things or in some projects. Yeah.
Can you see my screen? Please, if you can see my screen, just leave a comment on the chat box so that I know that you can see my screen, or just leave, I don't know, just let me know, or somebody can just submit.
Yes.
Okay, all right. It appears I need to. Okay. So I'm speaking on understanding the fundamentals of policy writing. And while this is contextualized within the context of AI, it's likely going to be about understanding policy itself, or if you like, public policy. But of course, we need to understand that policy is not always public. There are also private policies. But we get there. My name is Adiboye Adegoke again, and I work with an organization called Paradigm Initiative. I've been introduced, so I won't spend time reintroducing myself, but at least you can see what I look like. The outline will be under, basically under like 9 outline. We have brief introduction, which is going to be the definition. We also talk about understanding policy writing. We look at the key components of stakeholders in policy writing. I mean, policy creation. We also differentiate between types of policies, and we will talk about developing AI-specific policies, and we'll also be analyzing the impact of policies and also how to incorporate stakeholder feedback. And finally, we will navigate regulation and compliance issues. And we go to the conclusion, which is basically to also get questions and comment from the room. The time that has been allocated for this session is so small that I'm going to have to deploy every skills that I've gathered over the years for summary to be able to stay within the time. Also, I will have to finish this session at least 5 minutes before time because I have another meeting immediately after now, and I will need about 5 minutes to transition into that meeting. So I hope that we make the best of the time that is available for this session. So just to go to the introduction, I want to say thanks to everybody who has helped to give us their perspective of policy, but we can define policy as a deliberate system of guidelines to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes. So policy is about guidelines, but also it's tied to a particular objective, to a particular outcome. It's a statement of intention, and it's, that is implemented as a procedure or a protocol. They are usually adopted by a governance body within an organization or within a state, an institution, etc. The second outline is about structure of a policy document. What does the structure of a policy document look like? I think one of the most important aspects of the structure of a policy document is the title. The title has to be clear and concise because the title gives an indication of what the policy is addressing. The title must be written in a clear and concise way. So one of the things you have to learn about policy is that one of the things you don't want to do is when you come up with a policy, you don't want to write such an elaborate title that it looks like a statement. The title is supposed to be catchy, clear, where people see it, they know exactly what you're talking about. But it must also be short. It must not be too long to the point that people are wondering what exactly is happening here. Also, there has to be a purpose. So when you have a policy, the first thing you see when you open the first page of the policy is, why do we need the policy in the first place? So one of the things you will see is, oh, this is why we have to come up with this policy. So that's what the purpose is about. Why do we need this policy? Also the scope, what does it apply to? What is the limit of the policy? What issues are the policy addressing? That's like the scope of the policy. What are the issues that the policy seek to address? And of course, definitions. Definitions is looking at what are the key terms that you're going to use in the policy. Now, we are talking about AI policy, for example. There are chances that when you are developing like an AI policy, you are going to have to deal with a lot of technical jargons. So one of the things you want to do at the beginning of your policy document is that you want to explain some of the technical jargons you are going to use in the context of the policy. So an average person can pick up that document and understand what you're talking about. So there has to be definitions of the terms I was going to use in the policy. I mean, when I was talking about the definition earlier, I did mention that also there are different types of policy, like public policy, internal policy that organizations develop for themselves. So what you also would need to think about is that in some cases, depending on what the policy is seeking to achieve, it might not be as complicated as, you know, in terms of structure, there might be a smaller structure, a simpler structure, depending on the objective. But if a policy is public facing, one of the things you want to do is you don't want to leave out any ambiguity. You want to make sure that anybody can relate to the content of that policy. Also, policy statements, the core rules of principles. So what this policy statement means is more like the art of the policy, the key issue that the policy is putting out there. So it's about the policy statements this is what the policy is saying. So if you have policy statements, it might be 10 policy statements. So that particular policy document has 10 policy statements. That is like the flesh, the art, the entirety of that policy. This is what this policy is saying. That's what we mean by the policy statement. This is the core rules or principles that policy is articulating. Then the procedures. So after you have issued the policy statement, then you are looking at the procedures in terms of the steps to implement the policy. So you have said this policy will do this policy will do that, this policy will achieve this, blah, blah, blah. Then there has to be a procedure in terms of what are the steps to implement every single statement that you have itemized. Their responsibility, who is responsible for what? So there are chances that when you put out a policy statement, they might have cross-cutting teams addressing cross-cutting issues as well. So you also must articulate who is doing what. How do we ensure that this policy is implemented and who is supposed to do what? So when you put out a policy statement, you must also define very clearly who is supposed to do every bit of that policy so that there is a clear implementation guideline. So who is doing what is more like implementation guideline. You are saying that this is the person that is responsible for this element of the policy. This is the person that is responsible for that element of the policy. And I'm saying person, but in most time when you're dealing with public policy, we are talking about the agency, the institution that will be responsible, the ministry that will be responsible, etc. Then review. Policies are not meant to be static because reality changes. So there has to be a clear definition of how that policy will be reviewed. In some cases, you will say the policy will be reviewed every 3 years. In some cases, the policy will be reviewed every 5 years. For example, the Nigeria broadband policy is reviewed every 5 years. Every 5 years, the policy must be reviewed. So that has already been dictated in the policy itself. So everybody knows that after every 5 years, the current policy becomes obsolete and a new policy has to be negotiated and introduced. So what you want to take away from that is that if you are working on a policy, you must clearly indicate when that policy will be due for a review. And usually the way it works is that maybe a year or 6 months before that date, you already start the process of the updates to the document, so that by the time the current policy expire, you are able to, you are ready with the updates. Update sometimes doesn't mean that you have to change the entire policy. It might just be some specific elements of the policy that you are updating to provide additional context, etc. So that's it about structure of a policy document. Key components and stakeholders in policy creation. So if you want to create a policy, what are the key stakeholders you have to consider and what are the key components? The first thing you want to do is problem statement. I also already, suggested this when I was talking about the structure. What issue is the policy addressing? That's the problem statement. The goal and objective is that what do we want to achieve by this policy statement? Desired outcomes. Then alternative, possible courses of action. So when you're putting out a policy and defining the goals and all of that, you must also identify alternatives. If we don't go this direction, what will have been the other option for us to go or to explore? That has to be clearly itemized and identified in the policy as well. And of course, implementation plan, steps to put the policy into action. I think when I was talking about the structure of the policy, I already alluded to all of these things. Also, monitor and evaluation. One of the things you have to also be very, very conscious of is that you have to create a measurement and evaluation mechanism around the policy, because how do you know whether the policy has achieved its objective if you don't measure it, right? So measurement and evaluation plan has to be part of the policy. That's the only way you can ensure its effectiveness. That's also the only way. I was talking about updates the other time, that every policy must contain elements of when it is due for an update. Measurement and the evaluation tells you what or which areas you need those updates. That is what measurement and evaluation does to you. It helps you to see where you need to update the document. So, the policy, if you introduce a policy, for example, for 5 years, at the end of 5 years, and you need to update the policy, do you just update because the policy says you should update? No, you update based on the feedback that you have received about the policy. Feedback in terms of what worked, what didn't work, and what we need to improve upon. So talking about the key stakeholders for a policy, what you want to look at in terms of key stakeholders is government is usually especially when it's public policy, government is probably the primary key stakeholder, and they had the, how do I put it now? They are the policy driver most of the time, although the policy is facing the people, so the people are important. But government, key stakeholder, industry experts, civil society organization, academia, and end users. And I'll speak to each of these stakeholders because we are talking about AI policy specifically. And pardon me, I know the way I've been talking, I've not been contextualizing to AI. That's also because policy processing doesn't necessarily change because it's AI we are talking about. Policy is policy, whether it's AI policy, whether it's waste management policy, whether it's maternal mortality policy, whatever the policy is talking about, the principles are the same. But later in the presentation, I will speak to AI specific issues. So government agencies are key stakeholders in policy because implementation, government plays a lot of role in implementation, and you want to ensure that those stakeholders within government who have a role to play are carried along when you are developing your policy. Also, industry experts. Industry experts will be the technical community, the people who are developing the AI tools. In this context now, the people who are developing the AI tools, the big tech organization who are deploying AI tools in their work, etc., and all of that. So those are the industry experts. The civil society are public advocacy organization who typically will pay attention to issues around risk, issues around ethical implication of AI, for example. Civil society are usually the most vocal about those type of issues, but also most importantly, civil society play a huge role in helping to socialize policy. And of course, academia, these are the researchers. The researchers are key. They help us to understand what is happening in other climes, in other jurisdictions. They distill the issues. They help us to identify the gaps that we have. So they are also very key stakeholders. And also they provide thought leadership on many issues touching on that policy. And of course, end users. End users are the average person who is going to be impacted, who are going to be impacted, you know, by how do I put it now? We're going to be impacted by your policy, by the policy in question. Types of policies relevant to AI. Now we are narrowing this down to AI now because we've been talking generally about policies. And please pardon me, I know I'm racing very fast. The reason I'm doing that is I want to speak to my presentation and make sure I have some time at the back to take your question and also have some conversation around these issues. Type of policies relevant to AI, ethical guidelines. When you talk about AI, there are a lot of ethical issues that are at play. So there has to be ethical guidelines. So when you talk about ethical AI policy, one of the things we want to talk about is ethical guidelines. Those are frameworks that are responsible for, for responsible AI use. We talk about fairness, transparencies, and there are a lot of frameworks that have been developed in this context. So if you are interested, you can check. For example, there is a UNESCO guideline. For example, there are a lot of ethical principles. As far back as 2018, I was involved in what we know today as Toronto Declaration, which is a declaration on the ethical use of AI. You can Google that declaration, Toronto Declaration on responsible use of artificial intelligence. We also have regulatory frameworks that are relevant to AI, like the Data Protection Regulation. That is the Nigeria relevant regulation because AI, AI feeds on data. So data protection laws generally are very, very key and relevant to AI policies. So there are also legal requirements in most data protection laws touching on artificial intelligence. Of course, organizational policies too. One of the things that organizations are having to do is also because, as organizations today, you cannot run away from AI. People are using AI to write emails these days. People are using AI to write blog posts and all of that. So every organization also has a responsibility to develop an AI policies. What is the rules and procedure for AI deployment within your organization? And I also say this beyond the context of organizations who are working on AI themselves. I'm talking about everyday organization, civil society organization, government parastatals, academic institutions. Students are using AI to complete assignments. They're using AI to write research, their time papers, etc. Academic institution must develop internal policies on the use of AI. Some people talk about AI as something that is very bad for academic work, but the truth of the matter is that AI is a tool, an enabler, an amplifier that can be used to get things done. So what we need to think about is that how is AI applicable in academics? And that is what institutions should focus on. Institutions should not be obsessed about, oh, why are you using AI? It's not a crime to use AI. It should not be criminalized to use AI, but we must be able to create a policy around how we use AI for tasks, for assignments, for research, etc. And my organization, for example, we have developed our internal AI policies in terms of how we deploy AI for our work. So if you're going to use AI for work, you have to comply and abide by that policy. Also, purpose and applications. You have to also, so when I talk about ethical guidelines, what we are looking at in that context is to ensure that AI respects human rights and ethical principles. Regulatory frameworks is about protecting public interest and ensuring compliance. AI has such an unimaginable amount of possibilities, including those that can hurt people, including those that can hurt public interest. So one of the things public regulatory frameworks does or policy does is to ensure that you rein in those tendencies, you create a clear guideline to ensure that public interest is protected. And of course, organizational policy align the use of AI with your goal as an organization and values. So what is value academic, for example? Academic value is about originality. When people do research within the academic space, originality is a key value. So you want to protect that in the context of deployment of AI for research and academic work. So when you are developing an organizational policy, that is what the focus should be. How do we ensure that the use of AI in academic research or within the academic environment align with our goal as an academic institution that seek to protect ingenuity, innovation, and originality? So what are some of the best practices when we are developing AI-specific policies? You want to be sure that you have clarity, use simple language, clear definitions. Let me just quickly say that, please, if you have questions, you can note it down, you can write it down, and later I will take the questions like I said, I'm racing very fast so that I can have some time to take our questions. So what are the ethical considerations? I mean, we have to address issues like bias, privacy, and accountability. You want to ensure that your AI policy address issue of bias, issue of privacy, and issue of accountability. Then organization goals, I just mentioned this. You have to reflect your company's mission and vision and how that fits into it. And the process of writing the policy is number one, research. When I was talking about the stakeholder the other time, I talked about academics. Research is key to writing a policy. You can't just sit down and start writing policy. That policy has to feed on research. And what research will typically do is that it will identify the problem that you're trying to solve. It will define the problem. It will provide a background for it, situation analysis. It will also do a comparative analysis. Look at, okay, those problems that you are facing, that you're trying to write a policy around, where else has that kind of problem existed? What was done in those climes, and compare what was done in one climb to the other to be able to also glean from that experience to inform the policy you are trying to write. So research is very key to policy writing. Then there is going to be the drafting process. In fact, most policy, before you develop it, the first thing people do is when you do the research, you release a white paper. The white paper is the outcome of the research, giving stakeholders the opportunity to understand what direction you are going to. And once you have scaled that process, you want to go into drafting, write the policy document, put it out there. Then you want to start consultation, get that feedback from stakeholders. Once you do a draft, that's why when most policies are released, the first thing you see is draft policy. For example, in Nigeria now, the Ministry of Communications and Digital Economy has released a draft AI strategy. That's what they call it, draft AI strategy, because it has not been adopted. The idea is get people to even engage with the document first, let people give their feedback, what they think about it, what they think can be improved upon, what they think is a bad idea. Then once you do that, that's what the consultation is about. You take the feedback from the stakeholders, you use it to improve on the policy. You issue a clean copy, which is going to be approved. So you have to get the policy endorsed by the relevant authority. If it's a policy that has to be approved by the president, it has to go to the president's table. If it's a policy that has to be approved by a minister, it has to go to the minister's table. If it's a law, because when I talk about policy, policy is broad. Policy can also be a law that has to go through the National Assembly, has to go through legislative process and pass into law by the parliament. So you make sure it goes through that process as well. And after that, you go to implementation, putting the policy into action. Analyzing the impact of the policy. So we have worked our way into process of developing a policy. We now need to talk about analyzing the impact of that policy. For the government, where the policy has been introduced, and I'm using public policy as an example, government preoccupation is to enforce it, to regulate around it, to enforce it. For industry, the question we should be asking is, has this policy led to innovation, especially in AI policy? Has it led to competitiveness in the industry? Because when you put a policy out, it's all about public interest. What does public interest look like? Job creation, right? Boosting the economy, mitigating risk, protecting the people. So what you are thinking about in terms of potential impacts is that how does this policy, how does it achieve this objective? Has it created jobs? Has it increased the capacity for innovation, for example? So that's like you analyzing the impact of that policy. What are the implications? Has it made people more vulnerable? Privacy concerns, for example, has it taken away people's right to privacy? There's an AI video that was trending recently of President Trump and Kamala Harris holding hands and dancing together and all of that. So what is the implication for that? Also, I've seen a video of and I think this is a very relatable example. I know many people on this call are serious people, so you probably don't watch the Big Brother Ninja show. But there was a case, an AI case recently of where one of the housemates on that show was AI was used to modify one of their images to sexualize them, basically. So you are looking at how does an AI policy address those type of issues, as, for example, or as AI policy, has it even helped to encourage those type of, use of AI? So that's what the analysis is about. That's what the, analyzing the potential impact of the policies is about. So you want to evaluate the effectiveness of that policies. What are the examples of successful and failed policies? I spoke about the policy statement earlier. So you can look at the policy statement one by one, which one has been successful, which one is failing, which one needs to be improved upon, and the metrics. How do we measure this policy success? I talked about measurement and evaluation earlier when we are conceptualizing the policy. We also have to have integrated into the policy document the metric that we will use to. Sorry? Hello, were you talking to me? I mean, I've missed what was said, but I heard the voice, but I'm not sure if he was talking to me, but I guess I can continue. The thing is, because I'm sharing my screen, I cannot see the people in the room. So even if you are trying to make a gesture to me, I probably didn't see you. But I'll continue anyways. Before I move to the next slide, let me talk about feedback loops. You also need to be able to continue to seek feedback from stakeholders to help you to continue to improve the document. Because one thing about measurement of impact is that you need to hear from the people who are affected by that policy for you to really know whether the policy has worked or whether it has not worked, and for you to be able to identify where you need to improve on the policy. Incorporating stakeholder feedback is very key. And to achieve that, you have to engage each of the stakeholders. And to be able to effectively engage, you have to ensure inclusivity, which means you have to ensure that there are diverse perspectives and they are considered. When I say inclusivity, that means you look at every demographic, especially those who are usually underrepresented. Also, to get legitimacy, your stakeholder must have a buy-in. If people do not believe in what you are saying, even if you are able to get the government to approve the policy, it is going to suffer from legitimacy issue, because people are going to look at it and be like, you are just doing your thing. So that is also very, very important. That's why stakeholder input is important. If people contributed to the process, there is a way they have a sense of belonging. Also, surveys and questionnaires, they can help you to gather quantitative insights. So these are some of the ways you can gather stakeholder input, get some people to sit on your policy, and based on what you're trying to measure, draft questionnaires, and get your audience to be able to, or get the people to fill that questionnaire, the stakeholders, relevant stakeholders, let them fill it. That gives you an insight into how that policy has impacted the people. You can also organize a focus group discussion. For example, my organization is organizing a focus group conversation, an engagement session on Nigeria AI strategies in a couple of days, and also on the proposed digital economy and e-governance bill. So that type of focus group conversation, you bring people together. What do you think about this bill? How do you think it can be improved? You gather those thoughts and you use it as a feedback mechanism to measure the impact of the policy or of the proposed policy. And of course, public consultation, something government usually has to do is to consult the public, reach out to the public, which is what Nigeria is doing with its national AI strategy. That national strategy was announced publicly, and it was also announced publicly that, please let us know what you think about this strategy. Of course, we can also do workshop. What workshop does is that beyond just randomly asking people to contribute to a policy development, it provides an opportunity for you, for experts, to distill, analyze the content of that policy, help stakeholders to understand what exactly that you are trying to do. Because one thing about with AI policy is that because AI is also a novel, it's novel, and for a lot of stakeholders, they might still struggle to understand what the issues are. Through workshop, you can break it down for them, get experts to break down the certain element, how it applies to their everyday life, and use that as an opportunity to get people's feedback. Navigating regulatory and compliance issues. Within the context of Nigeria, and I assume that the participants on this call are Nigerian, so I deliberately make reference to the Nigeria Data Protection Regulation, We also have the Nigeria Data Protection Act now, which is an update to Nigeria Data Protection Regulation. Now, reference to this is a policy on its own as well. It's a legislative policy. Also, the EU GDPR comes to mind, which are all framework for data protection. I mentioned earlier the relevance of AI to data. I mean, AI is basically about data. So data protection laws have a lot of, relevance to data, I mean, to AI. But of course, we have also started to see uptake of AI-specific legislation. There is a draft legislation in Brazil currently, and the EU has come out with its own AI Act applicable in the EU. I think it became operational very recently, so it's still very early to be able to analyze its impact, but it's an example of regulation of AI systems as different countries are grappling with how to go about regulating AI. Nigeria has also recently published its AI strategies. I already mentioned that. We have the same for United States. There was an executive order on AI in the United States. The UK has also published its own. China as well has published its AI strategies. So what we also do in the global landscape is that it gives us an opportunity to make comparative analysis. So when we have multiple countries that have come out with this is our AI policy or strategy, or we have an AI law, we have an opportunity to make a comparative analysis of what is happening in various regions. And for countries like Nigeria that will come late to the party, they have a lot of examples to leverage, to learn from, based on what they have seen happening somewhere else. Yeah, so this is where I come back to you to let us have questions and also let us have comments. So it's not just about question. If you also have something to contribute to the session, or just a comment, a remark based on any part of this presentation, this is the time for us to look at those questions. As I said to you, I was rushing this presentation because I want to make sure that we have some time for this. So we still have 15 minutes for this session. So feel free to ask me questions so that I can touch on area that you are most interested in. Thank you very much. At this point, I will stop sharing so that I can see the people in the room. Okay, I see one hand up. We can start from you, and hopefully by the time you're done, somebody else will do. So feel free to unmute your mic and ask your question, or I'll give you a comment. If you are speaking, Praveen, I think this is Praveen Naido. Your mic is muted, so you might need to unmute your mic.
No, sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much. I was just acknowledging you and thanking you so much for the presentation. Very, very insightful. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
But just a question. I mean, I appreciate that, the jurisdictions will have their own AI policy. And I know South Africa, I'm from South Africa, so I see South Africa. I've just tried to get access to it now. But because we in a global space and data is accessed globally, I would imagine that irrespective of jurisdiction, policies need to be aligned, and yes, there will be individual a country specific concerns and context, but I think policies often are so localized, it becomes a problem because it becomes somewhat irrelevant then, because we have to appreciate it in terms of the global context, based on the fact that we access data as we do from all sources. I hope I'm expressing myself appropriately.
Absolutely. I totally understand what you're saying. And what you're saying, I think it falls under the concept of digital sovereignty, how it appears as a lot of nations, countries are trying to develop laws, policy, regulations to kind of create a we'll call it like an echo, no, not an echo chamber. Echo chamber will not be the right word. Like a wall. Like a wall. We know that the internet, for example, is borderless, and technology has that tendency to be borderless as well. And I do agree with you when you mentioned the need for this, what is being developed by each country to speak to themselves, to be able to have that cross geographical impact There is a lot of politics that are happening at the global level in terms of the governance of technology generally. Countries like Russia, China, for example, they are pushing so much for digital sovereignty, in which case everybody can literally have their own internet, regulate issues relating to technology in the way that is so deemed fit. But there is also another school of thought who want a centralized system whereby there can be uniform principles that everybody then work with, which then create that easier, easier framework that can speak to themselves, so that when Nigeria develops its own AI policy, it's not a significant departure from what applies everywhere. Of course, contextualization is also applicable in this context. You have to contextualize to your reality, but at the same time, your policy must not be insulated to what is happening elsewhere. If you look at what happens with data protection, most jurisdictions followed afterward the EU. The EU GDPR, which is a good thing, but there are a lot of people who have issues with that as well, because a lot of people are angry for many reasons. People are angry because of what seems like the dominance of the West. And that, again, that's also within the context of global politics. However, technology is such a dynamic, innovation that you really can't do things in silos, and you cannot maximize the impact of any technology if you are operating in silos. So for example, if we limit what you can, for example, on your Google search, for example, if you limit what you can see to what your country or your nation can determine, imagine what limitation that does to you as a person. So I do understand the arguments or the need for AI policies to be developed in such a way that it is fluid, it is relevant outside your jurisdiction. It also allows for cross-regional collaboration, which is something that cannot, we can't run away from. And I think one context we need to also factor into this deliberation is the difference between the EU and Africa, and also most jurisdictions across the world. The EU has a centralized regulatory system. So there is an EU parliament, for example, that can make law for the entirety of EU. So when EU says that they are introducing an AI Act, it applies virtually to all the countries in the EU. But unfortunately, we cannot do that. Even though in Africa, we have the African Union also coming up with, AI decisions, the African Commission, the African Union, they are meeting. They just released what we call the African Digital Compact, for example. They are also trying to provide some sort of normative frameworks around the governance of technology on the continent. But because we don't have a central regulation system in Africa, that cannot automatically apply for every African country. So every African country, we have to develop their policy. But what advocacy does is that I work for an advocacy organization. One of the things we try to do is to use some of these instruments as normative framework, so that whatever is developed at the national level, gaining a lot from that normative framework. If we're able to achieve that, we're able to have national policies that reflect some common set of values and principles, so that they are not a clear departure from one another. I don't know whether that helps to address your question, Previn.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. But I just want to raise another point. I think that the relevance of this platform, the Pan-Africa AI Ethics Academy, it's so relevant, because if all policies are grounded in principles, it could be applicable anywhere in the world, as opposed to us defaulting to a compliance mentality.
I totally understand what you say, but I think where the challenge is also being able to agree on the principles. So, for example, at the UN level now, they are currently, in fact, they are negotiating the Global Digital Compact, which is literally going forward to define how the governance of technology will be approached from from a global level. But that has led to a lot of back and forth, because there are certain principles that some of the countries are not agreeing to. So we don't have uniformity of principles and values. The Western people have their own value, they have their own principle, even though a lot of times that we can argue about whether they actually are committed to those principles. But of course, There's also the Chinese, the Russian blocs who also have their own principles. So a lot of times at the global level, there is no consensus around this principle. As a matter of fact, a cybercrime treaty has just been agreed, also at the level of the UN. And there are a lot of pushback on that agreed treaty. A lot of people are not comfortable with some of the elements of the agreed principle. So even sometimes when the nations agreed, other stakeholders have reservations. Private sector are saying that this principle that you are agreeing on will hurt our business interests. Civil society is saying that this principle you have agreed on would have diverse, adverse rather, impacts on human rights. It will create a lot of risk factors, etc. So that lack of consensus on principles has also not been helpful. But of course, the role of regional organization, global organization, is to create or articulate some of these principles to serve as inspiration for what is being developed at the national level. To what extent has this regional institution or global institution, to what extent have they been performing that responsibility? I think they have been doing it significantly, but then because they are not binding on national government, there is really not much you can do to ensure adherence to those principles. You can only use them as normative framework, as I mentioned earlier, and they are also useful tools for civil society to engage the national government to say that these are the best principles for us to use. And I do think that what makes this most challenging is the fact that most principles that are agreed on are mostly advice for national governments. National government will fully articulate or implement their own right to sovereignty in terms of how they determine what they want to do from time to time, depending on the kind of governance system that exists in one country to the other. For countries that have bad reputation with despotic rule, for example, you would see that any principle that seems to foster human rights, promotes international human rights standards, they will not find it attractive. And even if those principles exist, they will ignore it and still do what they want to do. So these are the issues, actually. Any other thoughts from the room? Bibi Tayo Ojo, I've not heard from you today. I'm not sure I've heard from Scott. Let me check. I see that there's a comment on the. Oh, okay. No new questions. So are there questions, additional questions or comments before we end the session?
Okay, sorry, Mr. Adegoke.
All right.
I think one of the questions I will have asked has been trashed. So I wanted to just know more about the policy documentations within organizations and the government policies. But from your discussions, I understood the fact that it's still almost the same thing, still going to follow the same principle. So the internal policy of organizations can also actually be tailored towards what is obtainable within the jurisdiction where the company is located. I hope I got you right. Does that answer the question? Sure, am I audible, please?
Oh, sorry, I didn't unmute my mic. I was actually speaking. I said, please, can you come back to where you were talking about jurisdiction? I mean, I've lost you for about 4 or 5 seconds.
Okay, so I said, if I heard you correctly, I just want to confirm that that answered my question correctly. That internal policy of organizations on AI should be fashioned toward what is obtainable within the jurisdiction, or any best practice that has been issued that can actually relate or affect such organization or such sector. So for instance, if you're adopting AI systems in education, if there is no any industry specific policy or regulation in that regard on best practice for AI, organizations can tilt towards what is obtainable within the country. So I just want to confirm that is actually the best practice, or an organization can just go ahead and just document their own
Policy.
internal policy based on
All right,
probably what is obtainable globally.
all right, let me quickly respond to that. So organizations also differ. Some organizations are public facing, some are not. So when an organization is developing its internal AI policy, so let's use academic institution, for example. You remember when I was talking, I talked about you have to define your own goal. What are you trying to achieve by this policy, and what are the problems you are trying to solve? In an academic setting, you want to probably develop your AI policy to solve the issue of plagiarism, for example, because AI encourages plagiarism, right? So you're asking yourself, how do we ensure that our students are not plagiarizing their assignments, responses, their academic writing, etc.? How do we guarantee that without also discouraging the application of technology in the academic sector? So you are looking at an opportunity for you to articulate your standard as an organization. Now, it's usually better in that context to work with what is global best practices, what is happening in another academic institution. The last thing you want to do is to limit yourself to your reality as maybe as a Nigerian, as a Ghanaian, as a Senegalese, as a Burundian, as a South African, as a Kenyan, as a Ugandan, as a Brazilian, as a Singaporean. Do not limit yourself. What are the best practices, right? You can use it to develop your policy. But what you need to do or be conscious of is that while you are doing that, make sure you are not violating any local law, because in terms of the jurisdiction where you operate from, you have to be in compliance with local laws. Where I think there might be an issue is if any of your policy has clashes with what is the law in your jurisdiction. So you cannot come up with ideas that will not be, how do I put it now, will not be valid within the context of your own jurisdiction, the laws and the policies that apply. But when you're developing an internal policy, it's always better to use the best practice, the international standards that exist. But while doing it, be wary that it doesn't conflict with national laws, national policies. Yeah, that would be my response to the question. I hope it addresses your concern, but I need to run off right now because I have another meeting and I need 5 minutes to transition. But I hope this has been impactful, and I hope that you've been able to learn one or two things through the session. As I said, this is not something one hour can do. I have to rush myself through it. I hope that there will be an opportunity some other time, maybe to dive in. In our online sessions where issues like this are being discussed, attend conferences, participate in global conversations around the issue. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, I'm guessing we're done. Sorry, I stepped off for a second. Thank you, Mr. Deboe, right? Thank you so much for that session. And we really appreciate your expertise and your time and your efforts to make sure that we had a great session. So I think if there are no other questions or no comments right now, I would just want to call it a day. We've had a very long session today. So thanks, everyone. Have a great Friday and also have a great weekend. See you on the Python sessions tomorrow. Bye from myself and everybody at the center. Thank you for your time today. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, C. Bye. Bye.